The most dangerous decisions are never made with guns or money, but with a single sentence spoken too coldly to ever be taken back. Rain hammered against the glass walls of Damian Calloway's penthouse high above downtown Seattle, turning the city lights into blurred streaks of silver and gold. The storm outside seemed distant compared to the silence inside the room. Selena Brooks stood near the marble fireplace, one trembling hand resting against her stomach while the other clutched the strap of her small purse so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. The soft jazz music playing somewhere in the background suddenly felt cruel, almost mocking, against the sound of her uneven breathing. Damian sat behind a black mahogany desk, motionless except for the slow tap of his fingers against a crystal glass untouched beside him. At 36, Damian Calloway had built an empire people feared speaking about out loud. Expensive tailored suits, cold gray eyes, and the kind of calm that made everyone around him nervous. Men twice his size lowered their voices when he entered a room. Rivals disappeared from cities overnight after crossing him. But tonight, the woman standing in front of him wasn't afraid of his reputation. She was afraid of his answer. "Say something," Selena whispered softly. Her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. Damian finally looked up at her, his expression unreadable beneath the warm amber glow of the office lights. Outside, thunder rolled low across the sky. Selena searched his face desperately for anything human. A flicker of concern, regret, even anger would have been easier than the emptiness she saw there. "How far along are you?" he asked calmly. The question cut deeper than if he had shouted. Selena swallowed hard. "Almost 3 months." Damian leaned back slowly in his leather chair. The movement was controlled, careful, emotionless. His expensive watch reflected the lightning flashing through the windows. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Selena remembered the man who used to stand beside her on this same balcony at 2 in the morning, holding coffee in one hand while the city slept beneath them. Back then, his voice had sounded softer. Back then, she had believed she was the only person who could still reach whatever humanity remained inside him. Now she realized she had been wrong. Damian exhaled quietly through his nose, the closest thing to emotion he had shown all night. "I don't want that child," he said flatly. Selena froze. The rain seemed louder instantly, filling every corner of the room like static. Damian's gaze never left hers as he delivered the rest of the sentence that would haunt both of them for years. "Get rid of it." The words landed with horrifying simplicity. No anger, no hesitation, just cold finality. Selena stared at him as if her mind refused to process what she had heard. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Somewhere below the penthouse, sirens echoed faintly through the wet streets of the city. Damian reached for the crystal glass but stopped halfway, his jaw tightening almost invisibly before he lowered his hand again. Selena noticed the movement. It was the only sign he wasn't made entirely of stone. Tears filled her eyes, but she fought them back stubbornly. "You really mean that?" she whispered. Damian looked toward the storm outside, instead of answering immediately. The Seattle skyline reflected across the windows behind him, fractured by rainwater running down the glass like tears the building itself couldn't hold back. "A child changes everything," he said quietly. "And people like me don't get to have normal lives." Selena shook her head slowly, disbelief mixing with heartbreak. "That's not an answer." Damian finally stood. 6'3", perfectly composed, devastatingly controlled. The room seemed smaller the second he moved toward her. "It's the only answer I can give you." Selena felt something inside her collapse silently. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly breaking apart piece by piece while the man she loved stood inches away pretending not to feel it too. She wiped her face quickly before the tears could fully fall. "One day," she said softly, "you're going to realize what you threw away tonight." Damian's expression remained unreadable, but his fingers curled slightly at his sides. Selena noticed that too. Then she turned toward the elevator with one hand still protecting her stomach, as if instinct already understood something Damian did not. And as the elevator doors slowly closed between them, neither of them realized that 7 years later, fate would place them face to face again beside 3 children with his eyes. The rain had not stopped by the time Selena Brooks stepped out onto the empty Seattle sidewalk with one suitcase, $240 in cash, and a future that suddenly felt heavier than the storm clouds above her. Cold wind whipped through the streets, pushing wet strands of hair across her face as the glass tower behind her disappeared into the gray night sky. 7 minutes earlier, she had still believed there was a chance Damien would come after her. A phone call, a single apology, anything. But the elevator doors had closed, and nothing came. Selena stood beneath the awning of a closed coffee shop, wrapping her coat tighter around herself while taxis splashed through puddles along the street. Her hand drifted protectively over her stomach again. 3 months pregnant. Alone. Invisible. The realization settled into her chest with terrifying clarity. Across the city, lights glowed warmly inside luxury penthouses and expensive restaurants while she searched her phone for the cheapest motel she could afford. By midnight, she found herself inside a narrow room near the industrial district south of downtown. The carpet smelled faintly of bleach and cigarette smoke no matter how wide she opened the window. Neon from a liquor store sign flickered red across the cracked ceiling every few seconds. Selena sat slowly on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to cry. Not loudly, just silent tears sliding down exhausted cheeks while thunder rolled outside. She cried for the man she thought loved her. She cried for the future that had vanished in a single sentence. But most of all, she cried because deep down, she already knew she was going to keep the baby no matter how impossible life became. 2 weeks later, the doctor stared at the ultrasound screen longer than normal. Selena noticed the shift instantly. "Is something wrong?" she asked, quietly from the examination table. The older woman looked back at her with visible surprise before turning the monitor slightly. "Miss Brooks," she said carefully, "you are not carrying one baby." Selena felt her stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" The doctor pointed gently toward the screen. "You are carrying triplets." The room went silent except for the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Selena stared blankly at the blurry shapes on the monitor while her pulse pounded in her ears. 3 heartbeats. 3 tiny lives moving on the screen where she had expected to see one. The doctor continued speaking softly, but the words came in fragments. High-risk pregnancy. Complications. Bed rest. Additional expenses. Possible danger during delivery. Selena barely heard any of it. Her mind kept returning to Damien's cold voice repeating the same sentence over and over. Get rid of it. Her throat tightened painfully. She could barely afford groceries for herself. Now there were 3 babies depending on her survival. That night, Selena sat alone at a 24-hour diner near the hospital with untouched coffee cooling between her hands. Rainwater dripped slowly from her coat onto the floor beside the booth. Around her, strangers laughed softly over late dinners while an old country song played through worn speakers overhead. Nobody noticed the exhausted young woman silently staring at an ultrasound photo under flickering lights. Selena looked down at the 3 tiny shapes again and pressed trembling fingers against the paper. "I do not know how I am going to do this," she whispered shakily, "but I promise none of you will ever feel unwanted." Her voice broke completely on the last word. Outside the diner window, headlights blurred through the rain like fading stars. And somewhere far above the city in a warm penthouse filled with silence and marble floors, Damien Calloway poured himself another glass of whiskey without knowing that the family he had rejected was already fighting to survive without him. Winter arrived early that year in Seattle, wrapping the city in freezing rain and gray skies that seemed to drain the color from everything except the glowing neon. Signs outside late-night diners and convenience stores. Selena Brooks stood behind the counter of a 24-hour grocery store at 3:15 in the morning, scanning canned soup and frozen dinners for exhausted strangers, while quietly fighting waves of nausea behind a tired smile. Her pregnancy had become impossible to hide now. At 5 months, her stomach curved visibly beneath the oversized blue uniform she wore every night, and the pressure on her lower back felt unbearable after standing for 10 straight hours beneath fluorescent lights. But rent still had to be paid. Doctor appointments still cost money. And triplets meant every dollar disappeared before she could even hold on to it. "You should be home resting," her manager muttered one night while watching her struggle to lift a box near the stockroom. Selena forced a small smile. "Rest does not pay bills." The older man sighed heavily, but said nothing else because they both understood the truth. Nobody was coming to save her. Some nights, after clocking out just before dawn, Selena cleaned office buildings downtown before taking a crowded bus back to her apartment south of the city. The place barely qualified as livable. Cracked windows let cold air slip through every night, and the radiator groaned loudly like it was fighting to stay alive. Water stains spread slowly across the ceiling above her tiny kitchen table. Still, Selena kept the apartment spotless. She folded baby clothes donated by a church shelter with careful hands. She taped ultrasound photos beside the refrigerator. She whispered goodnight to her stomach before sleeping barely 4 hours at a time. Because even exhausted, she refused to let her babies grow inside hopelessness. One icy February morning, Selena nearly collapsed while stepping off the bus downtown. A sharp pain twisted through her side, so suddenly she grabbed the metal rail to steady herself. Snow drifted lightly across the sidewalk while strangers rushed past without noticing the pregnant woman struggling to breathe. Her doctor had warned her this could happen. Triplets pushed her body beyond its limits. Stress made everything worse. But stress had become permanent. Now, stitched into every hour of her life. At the hospital later that afternoon, soft monitor beeps filled the examination room while the nurse adjusted sensors across Selena's stomach. "You need to slow down," the doctor said firmly after reviewing her chart. "Your blood pressure is dangerously high." Selena looked down quietly. "I cannot afford to stop working." The doctor removed his glasses with visible frustration. "Then at least ask family for help." Selena almost laughed at how impossible that sounded. Damien's face flashed briefly in her memory before she pushed it away again. "There is nobody," she answered softly. The room fell silent after that. Weeks turned into months. Selena sold her grandmother's necklace to pay for medication. She skipped meals more often than she admitted. Sometimes she stood inside grocery aisles calculating whether diapers mattered more than heat. Yet through everything, she talked to the babies constantly. In the mornings while buttoning her worn coat. On buses crowded with strangers. During quiet walks home beneath cold streetlights. "You are loved," she whispered one rainy evening while resting both hands against her stomach outside her apartment building. "Even when life feels hard, you are loved." Upstairs, she slowly assembled 3 secondhand cribs donated by another single mother from church. One crib wobbled unevenly. Another had scratches along the wood. Selena fixed them anyway under the warm yellow glow of a kitchen lamp, while freezing rain tapped softly against the windows. She paused suddenly when one of the babies kicked hard enough to make her gasp. Then another movement followed. Then another. Selena laughed through tears for the first time in months. Tiny lives reminding her they were still fighting beside her. And somewhere across the city inside a penthouse glowing above the Seattle skyline, Damien Calloway stood alone beside floor-to-ceiling windows staring into the storm with a glass untouched in his hand, unable to explain why the silence in his home had started feeling less like peace and more like punishment. 7 years later, Damien Calloway had become the kind of man newspapers described carefully, and politicians pretended not to know personally. His name carried weight in private rooms lined with dark wood, expensive whiskey, and conversations spoken just low enough to avoid microphones. Entire sections of downtown Seattle now moved according to his investments. Luxury hotels rose where abandoned buildings once stood. High-end restaurants opened with his silent approval. Men in tailored suits waited nervously outside conference rooms just to earn 10 minutes of his attention. From the outside, Damien's life looked untouchable. Perfect. But power had changed him in ways even money could not hide. The warmth that once occasionally softened his face had disappeared completely. His gray eyes looked colder now, sharper somehow, like years of isolation had polished every remaining emotion out of him. He trusted almost nobody. He attended charity galas without smiling. He dated women whose names he barely remembered 2 weeks later. And every night, no matter how expensive the penthouse became or how high above the city he lived, he still slept alone. One rainy Thursday evening, Damien stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Chicago hotel suite overlooking Lake Michigan while assistants prepared briefing folders around him. The skyline glowed silver against the dark water outside, elegant and distant. "Tomorrow's schedule starts at 8 sharp," his assistant said carefully while organizing documents across the marble table. "Children's hospital fundraiser at noon. Then the downtown redevelopment meeting at 4. Damien loosened the cuff of his black suit jacket without looking away from the windows. "Cancel the fundraiser." The assistant hesitated. "Sir, your name is attached to the event." The press will be there. Damien exhaled quietly through his nose. Fine. 30 minutes. No longer. The assistant nodded immediately, relieved the conversation was over. Damien had become famous for ending discussions with silence instead of anger. Somehow, that unnerved people more. After the room emptied, Damien poured himself coffee from a silver carafe and stared at the reflection in the glass. 39 years old now. Still powerful. Still respected. Yet, something hollow lingered beneath everything he built. Sometimes late at night, memories returned without permission. A woman standing in the rain beside an elevator. Trembling hands protecting her stomach. Eyes filled not with hatred, but disappointment. Damien always buried the memory quickly beneath work before it could settle too deeply. Regret was dangerous in his world. Regret distracted people. And distracted people lost everything. The next afternoon, black SUVs lined the entrance of St. Catherine's Children's Foundation downtown, while photographers crowded behind velvet ropes in the cold Chicago wind. Inside, crystal chandeliers illuminated rows of wealthy donors sipping champagne beneath soft piano music. Women in designer gowns laughed beside silent security teams. Damien entered the ballroom surrounded by executives and bodyguards, his charcoal overcoat draped perfectly over broad shoulders. Conversations shifted instantly when he walked in. Attention followed him naturally, the way storms pull clouds. But Damien barely noticed any of it anymore. Public admiration had long ago started feeling empty. "Mr. Calloway, this way please," an event coordinator said nervously while guiding him toward the stage area. Damien adjusted the cufflinks on his wrist absent-mindedly as cameras flashed around him. Then he heard it. Laughter. Not polished social laughter from wealthy donors. Real laughter. Small, bright, unfiltered. Damien turned instinctively toward the sound near the far side of the ballroom, where volunteers organized children's art displays beside tall windows overlooking the city. 3 children stood there holding paper stars covered in glitter. 2 boys and 1 little girl, maybe 6 years old. The girl laughed while trying to fix glitter on one boy's sweater sleeve. Damien's eyes moved casually toward the woman kneeling beside them. Then everything inside him stopped. Selena Brooks slowly looked up from helping the children with their coats, and the second her eyes met his across the crowded ballroom, the entire room seemed to disappear beneath the weight of 7 lost years. For one impossible second, Damien Calloway forgot how to breathe. The ballroom noise faded into distant static beneath the violent pounding of his heartbeat as Selena Brooks slowly rose to her feet beside the children. 7 years had changed her in quiet ways. Her face looked softer somehow, shaped by exhaustion and strength at the same time. The young woman who once stood trembling in his penthouse was gone. In her place stood someone steadier, someone who had survived things alone. Her dark curls rested neatly over the shoulders of a simple navy dress that looked elegant despite clearly not costing much. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes, the kind sleepless years leave behind. But what shattered Damien completely were the children standing beside her. One of the boys turned slightly while adjusting the sleeve of his tiny blazer, and Damien's chest tightened so suddenly it almost hurt. The child had his eyes. The exact same cold gray eyes Damien had spent years avoiding in mirrors. The little girl laughed again while brushing glitter off her brother's shoulder, and Damien noticed the small dimple near her cheek. His mother's dimple. Blood recognized blood before the mind could catch up. Selena's expression changed the instant she realized Damien was staring directly at the children. Not panic, not fear, something sadder than both. Acceptance, like she had always known this day would eventually come. "Mom?" the smaller boy asked softly while tugging at her hand. "Who was that?" Selena lowered herself calmly beside him, smoothing his jacket gently. "Nobody you need to worry about." The words hit Damien harder than any insult could have. Nobody. After everything he owned, everything people feared about him, that was what he had become to her. Nobody. One of Damien's assistants stepped closer carefully. "Sir, the foundation director is waiting for your speech." Damien did not answer. He could not pull his eyes away from the children. The tallest boy reached for a paper star that slipped from the table, and Damien froze completely when the child instinctively adjusted the silver watch on his tiny wrist using his thumb the exact same way Damien always did. The exact same unconscious habit. Selena noticed Damien watching the movement. Her face paled slightly. For years, she had probably prayed they would never stand this close. Now the resemblance was undeniable. Damien finally moved forward before logic could stop him. Slow, controlled, but every step felt strangely uncertain beneath the polished ballroom floor. Around them, wealthy donors continued sipping champagne beneath chandeliers without realizing an entire world had just shifted silently between two people standing near the windows. Selena straightened protectively as Damien approached. Not dramatic, just instinctive. A mother positioning herself between her children and danger without even thinking about it. Damien stopped a few feet away from her. Up close, he noticed details that hurt more than they should have. The worn stitching near her purse strap. The careful way she hid tiredness behind composure. A faint scar near her wrist he did not remember. Evidence of years he had not witnessed. One of the boys looked up curiously at Damien. "Mom, why is he looking at us like that?" Selena opened her mouth to answer, but no words came immediately. Damien's gaze moved slowly across each child again. 3. Not one child. 3. His mind replayed that night 7 years ago with brutal clarity. Get rid of it. The sentence echoed now like something spoken by a stranger wearing his face. Damien swallowed hard for the first time in years. "How old are they?" he asked quietly. Selena's eyes hardened instantly. Old enough to know when somebody is not welcome. The room seemed colder suddenly despite the soft piano music still drifting through the ballroom. Damien looked at the children one more time, and for the first time since building his empire, true fear settled into his chest. Not fear of losing power. Not fear of enemies. Fear of realizing that while he had spent 7 years building a kingdom, the family he abandoned had somehow learned to survive without him. Damien Calloway did not stay for the rest of the fundraiser. 30 minutes after seeing Selena and the children, his black SUV disappeared into the wet Chicago traffic, while downtown lights reflected across rain-soaked streets like fractured glass. Inside the vehicle, silence filled every corner. His driver kept both hands tightly on the steering wheel, smart enough not to ask questions. Damien sat motionless in the back seat, staring at the blurred city outside, while memories he had buried for 7 years forced their way back to the surface. 3 children. His children. The realization settled into his chest heavier with every passing block. By the time the SUV reached his hotel, the storm outside had intensified. Rain hammered against the windows of the penthouse suite, while Damien stood beside the fireplace with his tie loosened and a glass of bourbon untouched on the table behind him. For the first time in years, his carefully controlled mind felt unsteady. He could still see the little girl laughing beneath chandelier lights. Still hear the boy asking why he was staring at them. And Selena's voice cut deepest of all. Old enough to know when somebody is not welcome. Damien closed his eyes briefly. He had spent years convincing himself that walking away had been necessary. Safer. Cleaner. But now all he could think about was Selena standing alone in the rain, while carrying 3 lives he never even knew existed. A knock interrupted the silence. Vincent Hale entered carefully, carrying a tablet and several folders beneath one arm. Vincent had worked beside Damien for nearly 15 years and understood danger better than most men understood weather. Yet tonight, even he looked cautious. "You asked me to look into Selena Brooks," Vincent said quietly. Damien turned slowly toward him. "Tell me everything." Vincent hesitated before placing the folders across the marble table. She left Seattle 7 years ago. Moved between temporary jobs for a while before settling in Chicago about 5 years back. Works at St. Catherine's Community Center now. Damien's jaw tightened slightly. "And the children?" Vincent exhaled softly. "Twin boys named Elijah and Micah. Daughter named Ava." Damien stared at the photographs Vincent slid across the table. School pictures. Birthday snapshots. Selena sitting in folding chairs during soccer games wearing the same tired smile he remembered from years ago. One image showed all 3. Children asleep together on a worn couch beneath a patched blanket, while Selena sat nearby grading papers from the community center. Damien looked at the picture too long. "There is more," Vincent added carefully. Damien said nothing, but the room suddenly felt colder. Vincent opened another file. Hospital records show Ava was diagnosed with a congenital heart condition 2 years ago. Damien's eyes lifted sharply. "What?" "She needed surgery last spring." Selena worked multiple jobs to cover what insurance would not. Damien stared at him in silence. Outside, thunder rolled low across the Chicago skyline. Vincent continued quietly. She never contacted you. Never asked for money. Never used your name. The words landed harder than accusations. Damien looked back down at the photos scattered across the marble table. One showed Selena asleep in a hospital chair while holding Ava against her chest beneath soft fluorescent light. Another captured one of the boys wearing sneakers held together near the sole with silver tape. Damien felt something unfamiliar twist painfully beneath his ribs. Shame. Real shame. Get me a full DNA confirmation, he said finally, though his voice sounded lower now. Vincent nodded once. Already done. He slid one final document across the table. Damien opened it slowly. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. The room fell silent except for rain tapping against glass. Damien lowered the paper carefully onto the table, but his hands no longer looked steady. For years he had believed loneliness was the price powerful men paid for survival. But standing there surrounded by luxury, expensive art, and empty silence, Damien realized something far worse. Selena Brooks had carried the weight he abandoned completely alone while he built an empire pretending none of it mattered. And now, somewhere in Chicago beneath the same storm-dark sky, 3 children were falling asleep tonight without knowing their father had finally learned the truth. 3 days after the fundraiser, Selena Brooks noticed the black SUV for the first time parked across the street from St. Catherine's Community Center just before sunset. It sat quietly beneath flickering streetlights while cold Chicago wine scattered dry leaves across the sidewalk. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside, but Selena did not need to guess who it belonged to. Her chest tightened instantly. She pulled Ava's coat zipper higher while the little girl balanced carefully on the curb beside her brothers. "Mom, can we stop for hot chocolate?" Micah asked hopefully while adjusting the backpack hanging crookedly from one shoulder. Selena forced a gentle smile despite the knot forming in her stomach. "Only if all 3 of you finish homework first." The children groaned dramatically before laughing together as they climbed into the aging blue sedan Selena had driven for nearly 6 years. But before she closed the driver's door, her eyes lifted toward the SUV again. A figure sat motionless in the back seat watching quietly through rain-streaked glass. Damien. Selena looked away immediately and drove home with both hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than normal. That night, snow drifted softly outside her apartment windows while the small kitchen filled with the smell of canned tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches. The apartment was tiny for 4 people. Coats hung near the radiator because there was no closet space left. Crayon drawings covered the refrigerator beside unpaid medical bills tucked carefully beneath magnets. One of the kitchen chairs wobbled whenever somebody leaned too hard against it. But laughter still lived there. That was the difference. "Mom," Elijah cheated. Ava complained while sitting cross-legged on the worn carpet with a board game balanced between the triplets. "I did not cheat," Elijah argued immediately. "You just keep losing." Selena smiled tiredly while washing dishes under dim yellow light. For a few precious minutes, she almost forgot Damien had returned like a ghost from another lifetime. Then came a knock at the door. The apartment fell quiet instantly. Selena's hand froze around the dish towel. Another knock followed, calm and controlled. She already knew who it was. "Stay here," she told the children softly. Selena crossed the apartment slowly and opened the door only halfway. Damien Calloway stood in the hallway wearing a charcoal wool coat dusted lightly with snowflakes. Even in the dim apartment lighting, he looked out of place there. Too polished. Too expensive. Yet his gray eyes no longer carried the same cold certainty she remembered 7 years ago. They looked tired now somehow. "Human. You should not be here," Selena said quietly. Damien's gaze moved briefly past her shoulder toward the sound of children whispering inside the apartment. "I needed to see them again." Selena's expression hardened immediately. "No, you needed to see yourself in them." The words landed hard between them. Damien accepted the hit silently. He looked around the hallway before lowering his voice. "Ava's surgery should not have depended on whether you could afford overtime shifts." Selena's face changed instantly. "How do you know about that?" Damien did not answer right away. The silence itself became the answer. Selena stepped fully into the hallway, carefully pulling the apartment door behind her so the children could not hear. "You investigated my life?" she whispered in disbelief. Damien held her gaze steadily. I had to know the truth. Selena laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Only exhaustion. The truth. Her eyes glistened beneath the weak hallway light. The truth is that while you were building luxury hotels and buying politicians, Elijah had asthma attacks in apartments with mold on the walls. The truth is Micah stopped asking where his father was when he turned 5 because he realized other kids had answers he never would. Damien looked down briefly. Selena's voice broke slightly before she continued. And Ava spent 6 months thinking she might die before 2nd grade because I could not afford her surgery fast enough. Silence crushed the hallway after that. Snow tapped softly against the old apartment windows nearby, while distant sirens echoed somewhere downtown. Damien swallowed hard, but no apology seemed large enough anymore. Then from inside the apartment came Ava's small voice. "Mom? Who is at the door?" Selena closed her eyes briefly like the sound itself hurt. But before she could answer, Damien heard tiny footsteps approaching from inside. And for the first time in his entire life, the most feared man in the room was suddenly terrified of what happened next. Ava appeared first, clutching a stuffed rabbit beneath one arm, while peeking curiously around the apartment door. Her dark curls framed wide gray eyes that mirrored Damien's so perfectly it felt almost unreal standing this close to her. Behind her came Elijah and Micah, both still wearing mismatched socks from their board game on the living room floor. The hallway suddenly felt too small for the weight of the moment unfolding inside it. Damien stared at the children while something painful tightened in his chest. 7 birthdays missed. 7 Christmas mornings. 7 years of scraped knees, bedtime stories, school concerts, doctor visits, nightmares, and laughter that had happened without him ever knowing. "Mom?" Ava asked softly again. "Who is he?" Selena's fingers tightened against the apartment doorframe. For 1 second, Damien thought she might tell them everything right there beneath the weak hallway light and falling snow outside the windows. Instead, Selena looked down at her daughter gently. An old friend. The words should have relieved him. Instead, they hurt. Because Damien realized he had not even earned the right to be called a stranger properly. Elijah studied Damien carefully with the blunt honesty children carried naturally. "You look kinda like us," he said suddenly. Silence crashed into the hallway. Selena closed her eyes briefly while Damien felt his pulse stumble hard inside his chest. Micah tilted his head curiously beside his brother, especially the eyes. Ava looked between Damien and her brothers before turning back toward her mother. "Is he from Seattle?" Selena blinked in surprise. "Why would you ask that?" Ava shrugged innocently. "Because you only get sad when you talk about Seattle." Damien looked at Selena instantly. The exhaustion in her face deepened for the briefest moment before she forced another small smile for the children. "It is late," she said quietly. "Homework and bed." The triplets groaned dramatically in perfect synchronization before shuffling reluctantly back toward the living room. But Ava paused near Damien one last second. "You look lonely," she whispered softly before disappearing inside the apartment. Damien stood completely still after she left. "Lonely." The words settled deeper than she could possibly understand. Selena watched his reaction silently before folding her arms protectively across herself. "You should go." Damien finally looked at her again. "I can help them now." Selena's expression hardened immediately. They did not need help now. Her voice remained calm, but every word carried years of buried exhaustion beneath it. They needed someone when Micah cried himself sick during Father's Day events at school because every other kid had somebody waiting in the audience. They needed someone when Elijah got suspended defending his sister after another student made fun of her surgery scar. Damien lowered his eyes briefly. Selena continued quietly, almost more to herself than him now. And Ava needed someone to tell her she was going to survive after surgery because I was too terrified to stop crying long enough to sound brave. Snow drifted harder outside while distant traffic echoed below the apartment building. Damien swallowed carefully before speaking again. "I know apologies are useless." Selena laughed softly through visible disbelief. "No, apologies are easy. Living with consequences is harder." The hallway fell silent after that. Then suddenly a loud coughing fit echoed from inside the apartment. Selena reacted instantly, hurrying back into the living room where Micah sat bent forward against the couch cushions struggling to catch his breath. Damien followed instinctively before stopping near the doorway uncertainly. Selena reached quickly for an inhaler on the coffee table while kneeling beside her son. Slow breaths, baby, she whispered calmly while brushing his curls back from his forehead. You are okay. Micah nodded shakily while gripping her sleeve tightly. Damien stood frozen, watching the scene unfold beneath soft lamplight and patched blankets draped across worn furniture. The apartment looked humble, tired, yet somehow warmer than every luxury penthouse he had ever owned. Selena held Micah carefully, until his breathing steadied again. Then she kissed the top of his head without noticing Damien watching her. In that quiet moment, surrounded by secondhand furniture and children's drawings taped to old walls, Damien finally understood the truth nobody in his world had ever taught him. Power could buy silence, respect, fear, but it could never build the kind of love that held frightened children together during difficult nights. And for the first time in his life, Damien realized he had spent years becoming rich while remaining completely poor in every way that actually mattered. Spring arrived slowly in Chicago that year, melting the last traces of snow from sidewalks while pale sunlight finally returned to apartment windows that had spent months trapped beneath gray skies. And somehow, little by little, Damien Calloway kept showing up. Not dramatically, not with promises or expensive speeches. He simply appeared quietly at the edges of their lives and stayed long enough for the children to stop looking surprised when they saw him. The first time he attended one of Elijah's soccer games, he stood alone near the fence wearing a dark overcoat, while parents crowded together beneath umbrellas sipping coffee. Elijah noticed him immediately from the field, but said nothing. He only played harder that afternoon, glancing toward the sidelines more often than usual. Damien never shouted instructions like the other parents. He simply watched silently with his hands in his coat pockets, and something unfamiliar softening his expression every time one of the children smiled. Weeks later, Micah cautiously asked if Damien could help him build a model airplane for school. The request came suddenly during dinner one evening, while Selena nearly dropped a plate hearing it. Damien looked equally startled. You want my help? He asked carefully. Micah shrugged while pretending not to care too much. You look like somebody who knows how instructions work. For the first time in years, Damien laughed. A real laugh. Quiet and rough around the edges like a sound forgotten too long. The model airplane took 4 hours and ended with glue stuck to Damien's cufflinks and all three. Children laughing uncontrollably at his terrible folding skills. Selena watched from the kitchen doorway without interrupting them. Because for the first time since that terrible night in Seattle, the apartment no longer felt haunted by absence. Then came Ava's follow-up appointment at the hospital in early May. Rain tapped softly against the windows while doctors reviewed scans inside bright, white rooms smelling faintly of disinfectant and coffee. Selena sat beside Ava gripping her daughter's small hand tightly, while Damien stood quietly near the wall. The cardiologist smiled gently after finishing the examination. Her heart looked strong, he said warmly. Everything is healing exactly the way we hoped. Selena lowered her head immediately as tears filled her eyes. 7 years of fear finally cracked open all at once. Ava grinned proudly from the hospital bed, while Damien looked away toward the windows for a second longer than necessary. Because he knew he did not deserve to feel relief that belonged to Selena alone. Later that night, the children fell asleep early after celebrating with pizza and cartoons piled together beneath blankets on the living room couch. Elijah's head rested against Micah's shoulder, while Ava clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. Soft television light flickered across the tiny apartment as rain whispered against the windows again. Damien stood near the hallway, watching the children sleep. They trust you now, Selena said quietly behind him. Damien looked down for a moment. I am still trying to understand why. Selena stepped beside him slowly. Because children recognize effort before adults do. Silence settled warmly between them. Not awkward anymore. Just honest. Damien carefully picked up a blanket that had slipped partly onto the floor and gently covered Ava's shoulders with it. The movement looked small, ordinary. Yet Selena suddenly remembered the man from 7 years ago who claimed people like him could never have normal lives. Watching him now beneath soft lamplight and children's drawings taped crookedly across old apartment walls, she realized something important. He had been wrong. Damien remained, kneeling beside the couch for a long moment before finally speaking quietly into the silence. Fear made me reject them. His voice tightened slightly. But loving them is teaching me who I should have been all along. Selena looked at him carefully then. Not the powerful businessman. Not the feared man from Seattle. Just a father sitting on the floor beside sleeping children while spring rain tapped softly against the windows. And for the first time in many years, peace finally entered the room without asking permission. If this story touched your heart, do not forget to like, subscribe, and share so more people can experience stories about love, dignity, and second chances.